I never thought a single evening could erase an entire life the way fire erases paper. One moment you are laughing, holding a plate of food, listening to jokes you barely understand but still smile at because everyone else is smiling. And the next moment, everything you ever built, everything you ever dreamed, is gone without even asking for permission. That day started like any other ordinary day that never warns you it will become unforgettable. The sun was already softening when I reached the backyard of my friend's house. It was supposed to be a small barbecue gathering, just close friends, nothing fancy. Music playing from a small speaker, smoke rising from the grill, people talking over each other, laughing too loudly as if laughter itself could protect us from the world outside. I remember holding a paper plate in my hands. I remember the smell of roasted meat mixing with the sweetness of cold drinks. I remember thinking, this is what peace must feel like. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, just people existing without pain for a few hours. I was wrong. There was a boy there, someone who always thought he was funny in a way that made people uncomfortable but still laugh so they wouldn't ruin the mood. He made a joke about fire, about how even flames behave if you respect them. Everyone chuckled. Someone added another joke. Someone else dared him to prove it. It was that kind of atmosphere where nobody wants to be serious because seriousness feels like a stranger at a party. I was standing slightly away, near the edge of the garden, holding my plate, half listening, half lost in my own thoughts. I remember looking at the grill and thinking how something so small and controlled could still become dangerous if ignored. Then it happened, not all at once, not in a dramatic explosion like in movies, but in a careless chain of seconds that didn't feel important at the time. A bottle was opened. Someone poured something they shouldn't have near the flame. A sudden rush of fire jumped higher than expected. There was a sound, sharp, angry, alive. People laughed at first, thinking it was part of the joke. But fire doesn't laugh back. It moved faster than anyone's reaction. One moment it was contained, the next it was. A gust of wind, a wrong angle, a mistake too small to notice until it becomes too big to stop. I remember stepping back. I remember someone shouting, but the words didn't form meaning in my head. I remember heat, not just warmth, but something aggressive, something that pushed against the air itself. And then I remember seeing my bag. It was placed near the seating area, where I had left it just minutes earlier. Inside, it was everything I owned that mattered more than anything else in that moment. My documents, my savings, my phone, my work papers, the small beginnings of what I thought my future was slowly becoming. Someone knocked it over in panic. And then, in the confusion, in the running, in the shouting, it fell too close to the fire. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. People were moving. Someone was screaming to bring water. Someone else was laughing nervously as if this was still controllable. But my eyes stayed on that one point. The flames touched it. At first it was just a corner, just a small darkening, like paper curling at the edges. My mind tried to convince me it wasn't important, that it could be fixed, that someone would step in. But fire does not wait for understanding. Within seconds, it spread through everything inside it, through my documents, my savings envelope, the small notebook where I had written plans I had never told anyone about. The smoke carried away the smell of my effort, my late nights, my patience, my hope. I moved forward without thinking. I remember hearing my own name being called, but it sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. I reached out, but the heat pushed me back before my hand even got close. And then something inside me went still. Not loud, not dramatic, just still. Because in that moment, I understood something I had never understood before. Sometimes loss doesn't arrive slowly so you can prepare for it. Sometimes it arrives fully formed, already complete, already decided. The fire didn't just burn my bag. It burned my direction. It burned the version of me that believed tomorrow was guaranteed. People eventually noticed. Someone pulled me back. Someone poured water. Someone shouted that it was over. The fire was contained again as if it had never truly escaped. But I was standing there, looking at what was left of my life, reduced to blackened fragments, and ash drifting into the air like it had somewhere else to be. No one knew what to say to me. Because what do you say to someone whose entire future just stopped existing in under a minute? I didn't cry at first. I didn't scream. I just kept staring at the place where everything had been, as if staring long enough could reverse time and return what was taken. But fire doesn't return anything. It only leaves. And that night, when I finally went home, I realized something even worse than the loss itself. Nobody had seen it the way I saw it. For them, it was an accident at a barbecue. For me, it was the moment my life split into before and after. And I didn't yet know how to live in the after. I returned home that night like someone walking inside a body that didn't belong to her anymore. Everything looked the same. The narrow street, the dim light outside our house, the familiar sound of a neighbor's television. But nothing felt the same. It was as if the world had continued normally without me, as if I had been erased from the schedule of ordinary life while everyone else stayed included. I remember standing at the door for a long time before I entered. My hands were still shaking, though I kept telling myself there was no reason for them to shake anymore. The fire was gone. The barbecue was over. People had left. Everything had returned to normal. But I hadn't returned with it. Inside the house, my mother was sitting on the floor folding clothes. She looked up when I entered and smiled the way parents smile when they expect a simple story about a normal evening. "How was it?" she asked. That question should have been simple. It was. My mouth opened, but no words came out. Because how do you explain that in a matter of seconds, everything you were building quietly, secretly, painfully, has turned into smoke? I sat down slowly, as if my body was remembering how to be heavy again. My mother noticed immediately that something was wrong. She put the clothes aside. "What happened?" she asked again, this time softer. And that was the moment the silence inside me cracked. I told her everything in pieces, not in order, not properly formed. The jokes, the fire, the panic, the bag, the moment it burned. My voice kept breaking as if even my words didn't trust me to say them correctly. At first, she didn't understand the seriousness. People don't understand loss immediately when it arrives wearing ordinary clothes. She thought I was exaggerating. She thought maybe only a part of it was damaged. Then she saw my face, and something in her expression changed. She stood up too quickly, walked to me, held my shoulders, and asked me to repeat it. Slowly, carefully. So I did. This time, every detail landed fully in the room between us. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. My mother didn't cry immediately. She just kept looking at me like she was trying to find the part of the story where it could still be reversed. Like maybe if she understood it differently, it would become less real. Then she asked the question I feared the most. What exactly was inside the bag? I couldn't answer right away. Because inside that bag wasn't just paper and money and documents. It was everything I had been hiding from everyone. My application forms, my saved money for a course I had not told her about yet, my identity papers I had been preparing to use to apply for work, my phone that held contacts, opportunities, messages from people who might have helped me leave this small cycle we lived in. It wasn't just a bag. It was a bridge. And it was gone. When I finally told her, her hands covered her mouth. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, like the body itself had decided to hold the shock in place so it wouldn't spill everywhere. My father came in a few minutes later. He understood less at first, but when he did, the room changed again. Not with anger, not with blame, with something worse. Helplessness. That night nobody slept. I lay on my small mattress staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again, as if repetition could find the exact second where I could have changed something. Moved faster, warned someone, pulled the bag away, said no to the joke, stopped the chain before it began. But the mind lies in moments like that. It convinces you there was a version of reality where you had control. There was. Around midnight, I heard my parents talking quietly outside the room. Their voices were low, careful, the way people speak when they are trying not to break each other further. "We can replace documents," my father said. But I knew he didn't believe it fully. Because documents can be replaced, but time cannot. And the opportunities I had been building quietly, those were not things you get twice in a life that already struggles to give you once. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. Not sadness, not anger, just emptiness. The kind of emptiness that doesn't ask questions anymore, because it already knows the answers won't help. I checked my hands like they belonged to someone else. I walked outside and saw sunlight and felt nothing from it. The world was still functioning, still moving, still alive. But I felt like I had been paused inside it. Later that day, I went back to the place of the barbecue. I don't know why I went. Maybe because I needed to confirm it wasn't a dream. Maybe because part of me still hoped something would be left behind that wasn't destroyed. Maybe because denial has its own kind of direction. The garden looked normal again. Cleaned, quiet, no smoke, no fire. Only memory. But when I stood where it had happened, I could still feel the seconds. Not see them, not hear them, but feel them like a pressure in the air that never fully disappears after something violent has occurred. Someone from the house saw me and came out. They asked if I was okay. I almost laughed at the question. Because okay felt like a place I had been removed from permanently. I didn't answer. I just looked at the ground where my future had burned and tried to understand how something so important could leave so quietly. On the way back home, I made a decision I didn't say out loud. I would not let this be the end of me. Not because I felt strong, but because I had nothing left to lose by trying. And strangely, that felt like the first small step of something new, even if I didn't yet know what it was. The days after that felt like I had entered a slow-moving storm that never fully passed. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside my life there was constant noise. Papers that no longer existed, numbers I couldn't access anymore, doors that used to open for me now refusing silently. The first real shock came when we tried to recover my documents. We went to the office with whatever little proof I still had left, photocopies, old records, anything that survived outside that burning bag. I remember sitting on a wooden bench, holding a file that suddenly felt too thin to contain an entire identity. People around us were talking about routine things. Forms, signatures, waiting numbers. It was a place where lives were rebuilt every day in small official ways. But mine didn't feel rebuildable. When my name was called, I stood up slowly. My father came with me. My mother stayed outside, as if she couldn't bear to hear her child reduced to administrative language. The man behind the counter looked at me without emotion. He asked questions I struggled to answer, not because I didn't know them, but because answering them made everything more real. Name, date, verification, proof. Each word felt like a test I was failing in slow motion. When I explained what had happened, there was a brief pause. The kind of pause people make when they are deciding whether your problem fits inside their system or not. Then he said something I will never forget. "We can help you apply again, but it will take time." Time. That word suddenly felt heavier than loss itself. Because I had already seen what time does when you are not protected by stability. It doesn't wait for you. It moves ahead and leaves you behind. We left with a list of procedures, steps, requirements, more waiting. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright for the kind of life I was now living. That was the first realization. Losing everything doesn't end in one moment. It continues through systems, through paperwork, through explanations you have to repeat until your own story starts sounding distant. The second realization came at home. I tried to go back to my small plans, the ones I had before the fire. I opened notebooks, tried to rewrite goals, tried to rebuild motivation like it was something that could simply be reassembled. But every attempt collapsed under the same weight. There was always a missing piece. Something I could not recover, no matter how hard I tried. Even people began to treat me differently, not out of cruelty, but out of uncertainty. Friends who used to talk freely around me now hesitated, as if they didn't know which version of me they were speaking to anymore, the old one or the broken one in transition. One evening, I overheard my parents talking again. My father said we should focus on survival first, on basic stability, on day-to-day life. My mother said something quieter. She lost her direction, and I heard it through the wall like a truth I hadn't admitted to myself yet. Yes, I had lost direction. Not just documents, not just money, not just objects. Direction. The invisible thing that tells you where your life is supposed to go next. The hardest part was not the loss itself anymore. It was the silence after it. The way the world expected me to continue, as if I still knew how. But I didn't. I started taking small jobs just to feel useful again. Nothing meaningful. Nothing connected to my old plans. Just tasks that kept me moving so I wouldn't sit too long with my own thoughts. Work became a distraction from remembering who I used to be. But even in those hours, I felt something shifting inside me. At first, I thought it was weakness. Then I realized it was something else. Adaptation. Slow, uncomfortable adaptation. One night, I sat outside alone and watched the sky. I tried to imagine my future as something still existing somewhere ahead of me, even if I couldn't see it yet. For the first time since the fire, I didn't cry. Not because I was healed, but because something inside me had stopped expecting immediate repair. And that, in its own strange way, felt like the beginning of survival. I didn't know it then, but life was about to bring something I had stopped believing in. A second chance that didn't look like a miracle. It looked like work. I met her on an ordinary afternoon that didn't look like it was going to change anything. I had gone to a small office in the city where temporary work listings were posted on a notice board. I wasn't expecting much. By then, I had learned not to expect things anymore. Expectation felt like a risk I couldn't afford. The room was crowded with people who were also waiting for something. Work, opportunity, permission to move forward in life. Fans turned slowly above us, making the heat feel even more patient and unbearable. I was standing near the wall when she first spoke to me. "Are you here for work or escape?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Most people asked what I was qualified for. Nobody asked what I was trying to escape. I turned and saw a woman slightly older than me, maybe in her late 30s. She looked tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from having seen too much of life without stopping it. "I don't know anymore," I answered honestly. She didn't smile at that. She didn't pity me either. She just nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. We stood there for a moment without speaking, and for some reason that silence felt safer than any conversation I had had in weeks. Then she pointed at the board. "There's a small training program," she said. "Basic skills, office work, communication, nothing glamorous, but it leads somewhere if you don't stop halfway." I looked at the paper she was pointing to. It didn't look special. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like something very ordinary that people usually ignore. But I had learned something by then. Extraordinary changes rarely announce themselves. I told her about my situation, not everything but enough. The fire, the loss, the documents, the reset of my identity. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something simple. "You're not starting from zero. You're starting from ash. There's a difference." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but the words stayed with me longer than anything else that day. She introduced herself then, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was not looking at me as a problem, but as a person still capable of movement. She worked with a small organization that helped people restart after crisis. Loss, displacement, financial collapse, personal disaster. People who had fallen out of their own timelines. I didn't trust it immediately. Trust had become expensive. But I also didn't have many alternatives left. So I agreed to attend the first session. The classroom was small, white walls, old chairs, a faint smell of chalk and dust. The other people there were like me in ways that were not obvious at first but became clearer with time, people who had lost something they didn't know how to explain without breaking voice. The instructor spoke about rebuilding, not as something instant, but as something layered. "Your life is not what you lost," she said. "It is what you do after losing it." I wrote that sentence down, though I wasn't sure why. Days turned into weeks. I learned things I once thought were too basic to matter: typing, organizing files, speaking clearly without fear, showing up even when motivation didn't exist. At first, I felt behind everyone. Then I realized everyone, they're felt behind their own expectations. Slowly, something began to shift. Not happiness, not healing, but structure. Structure is what returns first, when chaos begins to lose its grip. At home, my parents noticed the change before I did. I started leaving early and returning late. I stopped speaking about the fire as often, not because I forgot it, but because it started becoming less of the center of every thought. One evening, my mother asked if I was okay. I paused before answering. "I think I'm becoming something else," I said. She didn't ask what that meant. She just nodded. For the first time, she didn't look like she was waiting for me to return to who I was before. She looked like she was watching who I might become. And somewhere deep inside me, a small, unfamiliar feeling began to form. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Work started slowly, almost painfully slowly, like a hand learning to write again after forgetting how to hold a pen. The first job I was given wasn't anything important. Data entry for a small office that handled community records. Names, numbers, files that seemed meaningless to most people but carried entire lives inside them. At first, I was terrified of making mistakes. Every document felt like it could collapse under my touch, the way my own life had collapsed in seconds. But the woman who had brought me into the program, she didn't let me stay in fear for long. "If you treat fear like truth, you will never move," she told me once while correcting my work. "Fear is just noise, not direction." I didn't fully believe her, but I started acting like I did. That was the beginning of something subtle. Action before belief. Days passed in repetition. Wake up, go to training, sit in front of the screen, learn, fail, correct, repeat. It didn't feel like progress in the way people imagine progress. There were no celebrations, no dramatic breakthroughs, only small improvements that were easy to ignore unless you were paying attention closely. But I was paying attention now, because I had learned what it feels like when everything is taken away. And when you've been reduced once, even the smallest rebuilding feels noticeable. One afternoon, something happened that I didn't expect. I was assigned to organize older files that had been digitized from damaged records. Most of them were incomplete, burned at edges, partially recovered from disasters. The irony didn't escape me. I was rebuilding broken data while trying to rebuild myself. As I was scanning through one folder, I paused. A fire incident report. Not mine, not the same, but similar enough that my hands slowed without permission. I read the details carefully. Another accident, another careless moment, another life interrupted by something that started as a joke or a mistake. For a moment, I felt the old memory rise again. The heat, the panic, the sound of shouting that turned meaningless. I closed my eyes. But this time, I didn't break. I opened them again and continued working. That was new. Not forgetting, but continuing despite remembering. Weeks later, I was given more responsibility. Phone calls, simple communication tasks, helping people fill forms correctly so they wouldn't face delays like I had faced. At first, I struggled with confidence. My voice would shake slightly when speaking to strangers, but slowly, I learned to control it. Control didn't mean absence of fear. It meant functioning alongside it. One day, a woman came into the office crying because she had lost her documents in a flood. She was panicking, speaking too fast, unable to explain properly. I asked her to sit down. I don't know why I did it so calmly. Maybe because I recognized the shape of her panic. I understand, I told her gently. It feels like everything is gone, but we can rebuild step by step. As I said those words, something strange happened inside me. I believed them. Not as advice. As truth. After she left, my mentor looked at me for a long time. You didn't panic, she said. I used to, I replied. She nodded slowly. That's how you know you're healing, not because the memory disappears, but because it stops controlling your voice. That sentence stayed with me. Control of voice. Not silence. Not avoidance. Control. That evening, I walked home differently. The streets were the same, but I wasn't moving through them as someone lost anymore. I was moving as someone with direction, even if that direction was still forming. At home, my father noticed first. You seem lighter, he said carefully. I almost laughed. I didn't feel lighter. I felt stronger in a way that didn't make noise. My mother started asking about my work more often, not out of curiosity, but recognition, like she was slowly accepting that something had shifted permanently. But the fire still existed inside me. It just no longer burned everything it touched. Instead, it reminded me. It reminded me of what I had survived. And survival, I was learning, was not a single event. It was a practice, a daily choice. A repetition of continuing and stopping would have been easier. One evening, as I was leaving the office, the woman who had first spoken to me at the job board stood beside me again. She asked a question I didn't expect. Do you still think about that night? I paused. Then I answered honestly. Yes, but not the same way. She nodded like she had been waiting for that answer. How then? She asked. I looked at the street ahead of me. Now I think about what came after it. For the first time, she smiled. Not because my pain was gone, but because it had started turning into something else. Something that could walk forward. The opportunity came quietly, without announcement, like most turning points in my life had started to do. One morning at the office, my mentor called me aside. She placed a thin file on the table in front of me and watched my reaction carefully, as if she was testing whether I had truly learned to stay steady under pressure. There's an opening, she said. A proper position, administrative assistant in a larger organization. It's competitive, but you can apply. I looked at the file, but didn't touch it immediately. A proper position sounded like something far away from the version of me who had once stood in front of burning ash and watched her future disappear. I'm not sure I'm ready, I said honestly. She didn't argue. She never forced belief into me. That was her way. Ready doesn't come first, she said. You come first, ready follows. That line stayed with me as I held the file on the way home. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was excited, but because fear had started returning in a different form. Not the fear of loss, but the fear of possibility. Possibility demands responsibility. And responsibility meant I could lose something again. But another voice inside me, quieter, steadier, reminded me of everything I had already survived. The fire had taken everything once. And I was still here. I applied. The process took days, interviews, forms, questions that measured not just skill but confidence, presence, clarity. I answered them carefully, not trying to be perfect anymore, just trying to be real. When I left the interview room, I didn't know what would happen. I had stopped predicting outcomes a long time ago. So I went back to work as usual. Days passed. Then one afternoon, I was called into the office. The envelope was simple. No drama. No build-up. Just paper holding a decision. My hands didn't shake when I opened it. That surprised me more than anything. I had been selected. For a moment, I just stared at the words. Selected. Not rescued, not saved, not given. Selected. My mentor smiled, and she saw my expression. "You see," she said softly, "you were never stuck, you were just paused." That word, paused, felt different from everything I had ever told myself. At home that evening, I told my parents. My father didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, like something inside him had been quietly waiting for this confirmation. My mother cried, but not like before, not from fear or helplessness. From relief. The kind that comes when a long night finally shows signs of ending. But life, I was learning, doesn't only move forward in celebration. It also brings tests disguised as ordinary days. My new job began in a large office building in the city. Everything felt more structured, faster, sharper. People moved with purpose, spoke with confidence, made decisions without hesitation. At first, I felt small again. Not broken, but aware. There is a difference between the two. On my third week, I was assigned to assist in document verification for internal safety records. It was routine work, but something about the files made my attention slow down. Incident reports, safety logs, risk assessments. And then I saw it. A familiar type of entry. Fire-related accident report. My hand stopped before my mind did. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. And there it was, details of an incident that had occurred months ago during a private event. Not my barbecue, but similar enough that my chest tightened without permission. Carelessness, alcohol near flame, panic, damage, loss. I closed the file quickly, but something had already shifted inside me. Not trauma. Recognition. Because for the first time, I understood something deeply. What happened to me was not rare. It was repeatable. And that meant it could happen to anyone, anywhere again. That realization didn't break me. It grounded me. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A man came to the office for a consultation. He was part of a safety audit team reviewing past incidents. I was asked to assist him with documentation. When he walked in, I froze for a fraction of a second. Not because I knew him personally, but because he spoke with the same careless confidence I remembered from that night. The kind of confidence people have when they think danger only happens to others. We worked side by side for hours. At one point, he joked about how small mistakes become big stories. I didn't laugh. Instead, I said something I didn't plan to say. Sometimes those stories are people's lives. The room went quiet for a second. He looked at me differently after that. Not offended. Not amused. Just curious. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in that silence. I felt firm. That evening, walking home, I realized something had changed again. I was no longer only someone who survived fire. I was becoming someone who understood why it happened and how easily it could happen again. And that understanding, I realized, was not a burden. It was a responsibility. After that incident, something in the office began to shift, not in the environment, but in how people looked at me. At first, it was subtle. The way they paused slightly before speaking. The way they started including me in discussions where I previously would have just been a listener. Not because I demanded attention, but because something about me had changed in a way they could feel, even if they couldn't name it. Responsibility came faster than I expected. One morning, my supervisor called me into his office and placed a stack of files in front of me. "We need someone to lead the documentation review for safety compliance," he said. "You've been handling the reports well. I want you to coordinate the process." I stared at the files. Lead. The word didn't feel like it belonged to me. "I'm still learning," I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair. "Everyone is still learning. The difference is, some people stop speaking because of that. Others keep moving anyway." That sentence followed me all day. By the end of the week, I was officially assigned to coordinate a small team. It wasn't glamorous work. It was repetitive, detail-heavy, sometimes exhausting. but it required something I was slowly learning to trust in myself again: clarity under pressure. For the first time since the fire, I wasn't just rebuilding myself. I was responsible for structure outside myself too. And that changed everything. Because responsibility doesn't just test you, it reveals you. One afternoon, while reviewing a set of incident logs, I noticed a pattern. Similar mistakes appearing across different reports, minor oversights, repeated negligence, situations that could have been prevented if someone had paid attention earlier. I brought it up in a meeting. At first, there was silence. People weren't used to someone my age, my position, pointing out systemic issues instead of just completing assigned tasks. Then one senior officer asked, "What are you suggesting?" I hesitated for only a second. Then I said it. We need preventive training, not just documentation after incidents. People are treating warnings like paperwork instead of protection. The room shifted. Not everyone agreed. Some looked skeptical, some indifferent, but a few listened differently. And that was enough to continue. After the meeting, my mentor came to me. "You didn't speak like someone who is afraid anymore," she said. I thought about that. I didn't feel fearless, but I didn't feel invisible either. That night, I sat alone and thought about the fire again. Not the moment itself, but what came before it. The laughter, the jokes, the casual attitude toward something dangerous, the belief that nothing serious could happen because everyone was relaxed. That belief had cost me everything. And I realized something painful but important. My trauma wasn't just about what happened. It was about what people ignored before it happened. For a long time, I had avoided thinking about the emotional weight of that night. I focused on rebuilding, on survival, on structure. But now, it was coming back in a different form. Not as panic, as understanding. One evening, I found myself unable to sleep. I kept replaying the moment when the fire first jumped higher than expected. Not for fear, but for analysis, for clarity, for trying to understand every small decision that led to it. And slowly, something shifted inside me. I stopped seeing myself only as a victim of an accident, and started seeing myself as someone who had witnessed a preventable failure. That realization hurt in a different way, because it meant it could have been avoided. But it also gave meaning to what I was doing now. The next day, I asked for permission to start a small internal awareness initiative. Risk awareness sessions, I explained. Short briefings, real examples, not just rules understanding. Some people were unsure, but my supervisor approved it. So I began. The first session was small. A few employees gathered in a room, mostly out of obligation. I stood in front of them, holding notes I barely looked at. And I spoke. Not like an expert, but like someone who had lived through what the rules were trying to prevent. I didn't describe everything. I didn't need to. But I described enough. Enough for silence to settle in the room in a different way. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. When I finished, no one spoke for a few seconds. Then someone said quietly, "We never think it can happen to us." And I replied without thinking. It doesn't start by thinking it will happen. It starts by thinking it won't. After the session, I stepped outside and felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not pride. But alignment. For the first time, my past wasn't just something I had survived. It was something I was using. And that made it part of my future in a way I had never expected. The sessions didn't stay small for long. What started as a quiet experiment inside one office slowly began spreading to other departments. People talked. Not loudly, not officially at first, but in the way workplaces talk when something feels unexpectedly useful. More requests came in. "Can you do a session for our team? Can you explain the safety patterns again? Can you come to our branch next week?" I didn't feel like someone important. I felt like someone repeating a truth she had learned the hardest way possible. but the world around me started assigning meaning to it. One morning, I was called to a higher-level meeting, a room I had only ever passed by before. Glass doors, long table, people who spoke in measured tones and checked watches that probably cost more than my monthly salary once did. They had heard about my initiative. One of them said, "Your approach is different. It connects emotionally with people." Another asked, "Where did you learn to present like this?" I almost said fire, but I didn't. Instead, I said, experience. That was enough. After the meeting, I walked out feeling strangely detached, like I was watching my own life from a short distance. Because there was still a part of me that couldn't fully accept that something good was growing out of something so painful. That night, it came back. Not the memory as a thought, but as a sensation. Heat. Noise. Sudden panic that didn't belong in the present moment. I was sitting at my desk at home when I suddenly had to grip the edge of the table. My breath changed without permission. My mind briefly misplaced time. For a few seconds, I was not in my room. I was back there. Then it passed, and I sat very still afterward, realizing something I had been avoiding for a long time. I hadn't fully processed what happened. I had only learned how to function around it. The next day, my mentor noticed it immediately. "You're carrying it again," she said. "I never stopped carrying it," I replied. She nodded slowly. "But now it's closer to the surface." We sat in silence for a while. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You've turned your pain into structure for others, but you haven't made peace with what it did to you." That sentence didn't feel like criticism. It felt like truth being offered carefully. For the first time in a long time, I didn't rush to stay busy afterward. I didn't bury myself in work or tasks. Instead, I allowed myself to sit with it. The memory wasn't just fire anymore. It was everything around it. The laughter before it, the disbelief during it, the silence after it, and the feeling of standing in a world that continued while something inside me stopped. I realized I had never asked myself a simple question. What did I lose emotionally that day? Not physically. Emotionally. Trust, maybe. The belief that people naturally respect danger. The assumption that control is always present. The illusion that small mistakes stay small. And once I named it, something shifted. It didn't disappear, but it became clearer. That weekend, I didn't go to work. I went somewhere alone instead, a quiet place outside the city where there was open ground and wind that didn't carry noise from buildings. I sat there for a long time. And for the first time, I didn't try to fix anything in my mind. I just let it exist. Let the memory exist. Let the survival exist. Let the contradiction exist. Because I was learning something slowly. Healing was not forgetting. It was no longer being ruled by what you remember. When I returned home, I felt different in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Not lighter. Not heavier. Just more whole in a complicated way. As if the pieces of my life were no longer fighting each other for space. The next week, my work changed again. Not externally at first, but in recognition. A senior official told me they wanted to expand my program into a structured training module for multiple departments. Not just awareness sessions, a proper system. A framework. Something permanent. When I heard that, I didn't feel surprised. I felt ready in a way I hadn't before. Because now, I understood something important. I wasn't just reacting to the fire anymore. I was building something that existed beyond it. Something that might outlast even my memory of it. The day it became official, I remember standing in a conference room that felt too large for my past, but somehow just right for my present. There were printed documents on the table, structured plans, training modules, timelines, budgets. My name appeared in places I never imagined it would. Coordinator, developer, lead contributor. But what struck me most wasn't the paperwork. It was the fact that people were listening. Not politely, not casually, but seriously. As if what I had lived through had finally earned a place in decision-making instead of just memory. When the approval was announced, there was a small round of applause. It should have felt like victory, and in some way it was. But my mind didn't go to celebration first. It went back to that night. The fire doesn't disappear just because people clap for you later. It stays exactly where it happened inside you. After the meeting, several people came to speak with me. Some congratulated me. Some asked technical questions. Some wanted to know how I had managed to turn such a situation into something useful. That phrase stayed with me. Turn it into something useful. As if pain had no meaning until it was converted into productivity. I smiled politely, answered carefully, and moved through it like I had learned to move through most things. But inside, something was shifting again. Not breaking. Not healing. Just deepening. That evening, I received an invitation I didn't expect. A public safety forum in the city wanted me to speak, not as a participant, not as support staff. As a speaker. My first instinct was to refuse. Because speaking publicly about it meant reopening a door I had worked so hard to learn how to walk past without falling into. But my mentor said something simple when I told her. You don't have to relive it, she said. You only have to tell the truth it created. So I agreed. The day of the forum, I arrived early. The hall was large, rows of chairs, cameras, officials, professionals, people who understood safety in theory, policy, and procedure. I understood it in memory. When my name was announced, I walked to the stage slowly. The microphone felt heavier than it should have. For a moment, I didn't speak. Not because I forgot what to say, but because I realized something. This was the first time I was telling the story without being inside it. I began with silence. Then I spoke. I didn't describe everything. I didn't need to. I focused on the moments that mattered, the laughter before danger, the speed at which things can change, the silence of realization when control disappears. The room stayed still. No interruptions. No distractions. Just attention. And as I spoke, something unexpected happened inside me. The memory didn't grow stronger. It became more distant. Not in a way that erased it, but in a way that gave it shape instead of chaos. When I finished, there was a pause before the applause. A meaningful pause. The kind that happens when people are not sure whether to respond emotionally or professionally. Then it came. Later, as I stepped outside the building, a man approached me. He looked uncomfortable, not aggressive, just burdened. I was at an event like that once, he said quietly. We ignored a warning too. Nothing happened, but it could have. He stopped, struggling to find words. I just wanted to say, I understand it differently now. I nodded. And for the first time, I realized something important. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had started existing in other people's awareness as a warning, a lesson, a pause before repetition. That night, I didn't feel like I had returned from speaking. I felt like something inside me had been released. Not the memory, but the weight of carrying it alone. At home, my mother looked at me differently again. Not with worry, not with confusion, but with quiet pride that didn't need explanation. My father said something rare. You've built something from what broke you. I didn't answer immediately, because I knew it wasn't fully true. I hadn't built something from what broke me. I had built something from what I survived. And survival is not destruction transformed. It is continuation. That night, as I lay down, I realized something I hadn't been able to articulate before. The fire had ended my old life, but it had also started a new one that I would never have entered otherwise. And for the first time, I didn't feel trapped between those two truths. I felt held by both, The strange thing about healing is that it doesn't arrive when you expect it. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't feel like relief at first. For me, it began on an ordinary morning. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of stress or responsibility, but because my mind simply did not rush toward the past the moment I opened my eyes. That alone felt unusual. For months, my first thought each day had been shaped by memory, by what happened, by what was lost, by what I had rebuilt around it. But that morning, there was a gap. A quiet space where the fire used to be. At work, things continued to expand. The training program had become formalized now, integrated into onboarding systems. New employees were required to attend safety awareness sessions that I helped design. I no longer stood in front of small groups only. Now there were schedules, departments, structured modules, feedback forms. It had become part of the system. Something stable. Something lasting. But even as my work grew, I noticed something changing inside me that I didn't fully understand at first. I wasn't thinking about the fire as often. Not because I was avoiding it, but because my mind was slowly learning it didn't need to replay it to stay alert. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. Because for so long, the memory had felt like a warning system. If I stopped thinking about it, would I become careless? Would I forget what I had learned the hardest way? That fear stayed with me quietly. Until the night, everything shifted again. I was walking home alone after a long day when I passed a small gathering in a courtyard. A few people were cooking outside, laughing, talking, flames from a small grill flickering in the open air. For a moment, my body reacted automatically. A slight tension. A brief tightening in my chest. Then something different happened. I didn't stop walking. I didn't panic. I simply observed. The fire was controlled. The people were aware. There was no chaos, no neglect, no careless humor around danger. And I realized something that stopped me in my tracks for a moment. Not all fire is the same fire. That might sound simple, but for me it was. Because for a long time, fire had meant only one thing: loss. But now I was seeing it as something that could exist safely when respected. That night, I sat outside my home for a long time. Not thinking in fragments. Not replaying events. Just sitting. And in that stillness, something inside me finally loosened. Not the memory itself, but the emotional grip it had on me. I remembered the laughter before the fire, and for the first time, I didn't feel only anger or pain when I thought of it. I felt understanding. People weren't malicious that night. They were careless. And carelessness is not evil, but it is dangerous when it ignores reality. That distinction mattered, because it allowed me to see the event not as something that defined humanity, but as something that revealed human weakness. The next day, I did something I had avoided for a long time. I revisited the place again. The house was the same, the garden was the same, but I was not the same person who had stood there before. I stood quietly in the spot where everything had changed. There was no fire now, no smoke, no chaos. Just normal life continuing, as if nothing had ever happened there. And I let myself remember fully. Not in fragments. Not in panic. But completely. For a few moments, the emotions came, but they did not take control. They passed through me like waves instead of drowning me. And when they left, I realized something important. The memory had not changed, but my relationship with it had. I was no longer trapped inside it. I was standing beside it. That evening, when I returned home, I wrote something in my notebook. Not a story. Not a report. Just a sentence. I survived what I thought would end me. And I didn't feel sadness when I wrote it. I felt truth. For the first time, the fire was no longer the center of my identity. It was part of my history, not my entire life. And that difference changed everything. Because now, I could finally imagine something I had not allowed myself to imagine before. A future that was not defined by what I lost, but by what I chose to build after losing it. After that day, something subtle but permanent changed in the way I moved through life. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything suddenly felt fixed. Life doesn't work like that, no matter how much we wish it did. Instead, it was quieter. I noticed I no longer flinched at small reminders. I no longer scanned every flame in panic. I no longer woke up feeling like I was still trapped in that one moment of destruction. The memory was still there, but it had stopped leading me. At work, my responsibilities continued to grow. The training program expanded beyond our organization. Other departments, even outside institutions, started requesting guidance on building similar safety awareness systems. What had started as survival had slowly become structure, and structure had become influence. One day, I was invited to contribute to a citywide safety initiative. Experts from different fields gathered in a large hall: engineers, administrators, trainers, policymakers. People who built systems meant to prevent harm before it happened. And there I was again, sitting among them, no longer as someone who had simply experienced an accident, but as someone whose experience had shaped prevention. When I spoke, I didn't talk like a victim anymore. I talked like someone who understood consequences at ground level. I don't believe most incidents begin with disaster, I said during one of the sessions. They begin with normalization. When risk starts feeling ordinary, that's when it becomes dangerous. There was a long pause after I finished. Not disagreement. Not approval. Reflection. And that was enough. After the meeting, one of the senior officials approached me. "You've changed how people think about training," he said. "Not by theory, but by perspective." I nodded, but inside I felt something different from pride. I felt distance. Not from people. From my past self. That version of me, the one standing at the barbecue, unaware of how fast life could collapse, felt like someone I could see clearly now, but no longer inhabit. That realization came with both peace and grief. Because healing is not only about becoming better. It is also about accepting that you can never return to who you were before. That night, I sat alone and thought about everything that had happened since the fire. The loss. The confusion. The rebuilding. The responsibility. The influence. And I realized something important. My life had not returned to normal. It had evolved into something else entirely. Something shaped by damage, but not defined by it. I started writing more often after that, not just notes for work, but reflections, thoughts about prevention, awareness, human behavior under pressure. What surprised me most was that people began reading them outside my workplace too. Some reached out, some shared their own stories, some said they had changed habits after reading my words. I didn't realize it at first, but I had started doing something I never planned to do. I was translating pain into awareness. Not for sympathy, but for prevention. One evening, my mentor visited me at home. She didn't bring work. She didn't bring files. She just sat quietly for a while. Then she said, "You've reached the point where your past no longer pulls you down. It pushes outward instead." I understood what she meant. The fire was no longer something I carried alone. It had become something I used to protect others. And somehow, that made it feel lighter. Not gone, but integrated. That night, I stood outside for a long time, looking at the sky. I didn't ask questions anymore. I didn't search for meaning. Because I finally understood something I had been learning all along, without realizing it. Meaning is not something you find after loss. It is something you build from what remains. And I still remained. Years later, when people ask me about that night, I don't answer immediately the way I used to. Not because I am avoiding it, but because I no longer need to rush toward it. It has taken its place in my memory, no longer demanding attention the way it once did. My life today doesn't look like what it did before the fire. It doesn't even look like what it did in the years immediately after. It looks built, stable in a way I once thought was impossible for someone like me. The training programs I helped create are now part of formal policy in multiple organizations. What began as a small awareness session has become a structured system used to prevent exactly the kind of negligence that once changed my life. I am often invited to speak, not as someone who survived an accident, but as someone who understands how systems fail when people stop paying attention to small warnings. But the most important change is not in my work. It is inside me. There was a time when I believed my life had ended in seconds. Now I understand something different. My life didn't end. It broke open. And what came after was not a replacement, but a continuation built differently. One evening, I visited my parents in the same house where I once came home shaking, unable to explain what had happened to my future. My mother greeted me at the door the same way she always did, but her eyes held something new now, quiet pride mixed with peace. My father didn't say much at first. He rarely does. But before I left that night, he said something simple. "You didn't just recover," he said. "You rebuilt what most people would have abandoned." I didn't respond immediately, because I knew the truth behind his words. I didn't rebuild my old life. I built a new one that learned how to exist alongside what was lost. As I walked home later, I passed by a small gathering again. People cooking, laughing, a controlled flame rising gently in the night air. I stopped for a moment. Not in fear, not in memory, but in understanding. Fire had not changed. What had changed was me. I had learned the difference between danger and negligence, between chaos and control, between moments that destroy and moments that simply exist. And for the first time, I felt no weight in that memory. Only clarity. That night, I sat down and thought about everything in silence. Not the pain, not the loss, but the path. Because I finally understood something I had been circling for years, without being able to name it. I had not been defined by what I lost. I had been shaped by what I chose to do after losing it. And that choice, over and over again, had brought me here. To stability. To purpose. To peace that did not require forgetting. Only acceptance. And as I looked back at my life, I didn't see a tragedy anymore. I saw a transformation. Not easy. Not gentle. But real. And in the end, that was my happy ending. Not because nothing bad happened, but because everything that happened stopped owning me. And I finally learned how to live as someone who survived, then continued, then built, then became whole again in a different way. Years later, when I look back at that night, I don't see it the way I used to see it in the beginning. There was a time when just thinking about it would make my chest tight, like the air had suddenly become too heavy to breathe. There was a time when I would replay every second again and again, as if somewhere inside those seconds, I could find a version of reality where I stopped it from happening. But life doesn't work like that. Some moments don't change no matter how many times you think about them. They don't become softer. They don't become reversible. They only become part of you. And slowly, I stopped trying to escape it. My life after the fire didn't become perfect. It didn't become a fairy tale where everything magically fixes itself. I still had struggles, responsibilities, pressure, expectations. I still had days where I felt tired, confused, overwhelmed. But something inside me was no longer broken in the same way. It had been reshaped. The work I started with small awareness sessions eventually turned into something much larger than I ever imagined. At first, I was just speaking in small rooms, to small groups, explaining safety, explaining risk, explaining how small negligence becomes big destruction. People used to listen quietly, sometimes emotionally, sometimes just politely. But over time, something changed. They started remembering. They started applying. They started preventing. And slowly, those small sessions became part of a structured system. Departments began calling me. Institutions began requesting training modules. Safety guidelines were rewritten. My voice, once trembling in front of a simple office audience, was now part of official conversations about prevention and responsibility. But I never saw myself as important. I saw myself as someone who had simply survived something that should not be forgotten. Because I understood something most people only learn too late. Disasters don't begin with fire. They begin with normal moments where no one thinks anything will go wrong. And I had lived that moment. There were days I still remembered the smell of smoke so clearly that I would pause for a second, even in completely safe places. But the difference now was I didn't collapse into it. I observed it. I acknowledged it. And then I moved forward. One evening, after a long working day, I found myself walking back home through the same type of environment where everything once happened. A small gathering, people laughing, food being cooked outside, a flame rising in a controlled grill. For a moment, my steps slowed. Not because I was afraid, but because I was aware. There is a big difference between fear and awareness. Fear freezes you. Awareness protects you. I stood there quietly watching for a few seconds. I saw how carefully people were handling things. I saw how different it was from that night. I saw how control, attention, and responsibility completely changed the meaning of something as simple as fire. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel pain. I felt understanding. That night, I went home and sat with my family for a long time. My mother was talking about normal things, daily life, small worries, small hopes. My father was listening quietly as he always did. At some point, he looked at me and said something he rarely says. "You've come far from that night." I didn't answer immediately. Because far didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like transformation. I didn't become someone new. I became someone rebuilt from what remained. And the most surprising part was this. I didn't lose myself completely in that fire. I discovered a version of myself I never would have met otherwise. A stronger version, a more aware version, a more responsible version. A version that understands that life is fragile, but also repairable. That night, as I lay down to sleep, I didn't think about loss. I thought about continuity. Because I finally understood something I spent years trying to learn. The fire didn't end my story. It changed its direction. And sometimes, direction matters more than beginnings.